Well, let's see. We had an organ solo. We had children's choir. We had a bell choir. We had the chancel choir. Let's go home. We've had church. Just to echo what Stephanie said, what a privilege it is to be able to be able to celebrate God through music this way that we can offer. And I have to have just a personal moment again to say that my wife and I were at the In Unison concert, the annual one for Black History Month at Powell Hall. It's part of the symphony. That In Unison is what Kevin has conducted since 2011, and for the third year in a row, it has sold out. And whenever you get the playbill and you read the bio of Kevin, it says, first and foremost, Director of Music Ministries in Manchester United Methodist Church. That is going beyond the walls of the church. Just a little thank you. Well done. Well done. I want to continue the series on change, transitions. We talked about that last seems sometimes like last week, when we talked about how every stage of our lives, Jesus has something to say to us. As we change in a way, then Jesus changes. Today we're going to talk about a change that hits every one of us. Now we'll all go through various types of change that will involve grief. We'll say goodbye from one job to another. We will say goodbye from one home to another, one town to another, maybe one relationship to another as relationships change, one school to another. But the one thing we all will have in common is that multiple times throughout our lives, we will say goodbye to people through death. Grief is the interest that we pay on lives well lived and relationships well lived, and there's no getting around it. And it is pain that stays. The longer you have been invested in a close relationship, the longer that pain will remain as you try to move on past that relationship because of death. No way around it. But what I want to do today is to talk about an amazing encounter that Jesus had that will speak to us in such times. It is not meant to be some pill that, I feel all better by the time we leave. What it's meant to do, my remarks based on this story, is simply to give you something that will be food for your soul, to continue nourishing your soul as you do go through and continue going through the very human process of grief. And at the end of the tunnel of that will be hope. Let me tell you a little bit about the story you're about to hear. There once was a man named Jairus. He was the leader of a synagogue in a village that Jesus was wandering through with his disciples. Jairus had a 12-year-old daughter, and I think it's pretty safe to say that this daughter was the apple of his eye, as daughters are. Mischievous, charming, playful, with a little, no doubt, rag doll that girls instinctively cling to as part of just who they are as they grow up. But when she turned 12, she wasn't charming, mischievous, and playful any longer, because now she lay on a mat in their home, and she was feverish. She was in pain, trying to move from side to side to alleviate, to find some comfort, as her mother pressed a wet rag upon her forehead to try to keep her cool. Nothing worked. The father, Jairus, who had tried everything, tries one last thing. Word that this holy man who has healed people is coming through the village. So as a last resort, he comes and kneels before him. Here's a story that this is where the story that Tim will read picks up. As you hear the story, listen very carefully to what Jesus says and note very carefully what Jesus does. Would you please stand?
Jesus crossed the lake again, and on the other side, a large crowd gathered around him on the shore. Jairus, one of the synagogue leaders, came forward. When he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded with him, "My daughter is about to die. Please, come and place your hands on her so that she can be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A swarm of people were following Jesus, crowding in on him. While Jesus was still speaking with her, messengers came from the synagogue leader's house, saying to Jairus, "Your daughter has died. Why bother the teacher any longer?" But Jesus overheard their report and said to the synagogue leader, "Don't be afraid. Just keep trusting." He didn't allow anyone to follow him except Peter, James, and John, James's brother. They came to the synagogue leader's house, and when he saw a commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly, he went in and said to them, "What's all this commotion and crying about? The child isn't dead. She's only sleeping." They laughed at him, but he threw them all out. Then, taking the child's parents and his disciples with them, he went to the room where the child was. Taking her hand, he said to her, "Talitha koum," which means, "Young woman, get up." Suddenly the young woman got up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. They were shocked. He gave them strict orders that no one should know what had happened. Then he told them to give her something to eat. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
You may be seated. They were shocked. Well put. Shocked. Jesus always shocked people. Jesus always would take the ordinary and cast it in such an extraordinary way that people were caught breathless. And that's what happened here. It's needed because when we're in grief, we focus normally, ordinarily upon our pain. And it lingers. When spouses have died within this congregation, the surviving spouse finds it difficult at times to return to church. Why? Because of the memories, where they sat in the pew, events that happened here. Of course, we get consumed, and often we will take that for the rest of our lives. And so what does Jesus do at the very beginning? Shocks us. Shocks us. And I want to mention 4 ways that he shocks us in the midst of our grief. And I have provided space if you would like to take notes in your bulletin. On the back side at the bottom, there are places that you can write these 4 things that are striking that Jesus does, how he addresses us in our ongoing grief. And here's the first thing he does. Jesus demeans, insults, rebukes death by simply calling it sleep. The young girl is not dead, she's sleeping. Now, sleep is not the idea I get for death. That's not the image I have, nor is it you. I mean, obviously, the classical image of death is the shrouded grim reaper that points out a skeletal hand beckoning you here. Not exactly sleep, if you know what I mean. Or it's a skull and crossbones of a pirate ship. Or if you watch the movie it's a demonic clown with a red balloon. And you will never see clowns the same way after you see that movie. That's death. But Jesus says, no. Death is sleep. Something natural, something normal, something you wake up from without even being prodded. Whenever you are near Jesus, what you think is scary at the end is not scary nor the end. He reframes it totally simply by being in his presence. She's not dead. She's sleeping. And that gets their attention. What does he mean? Remember that in your case. Because whenever you sit in the pew in a memorial service or whatever you want to call it, that's not what we're thinking of death being. We think of death as final, as something that has taken someone away from us. And Jesus says, listen to me. She is only asleep. The second shocking thing is this: Jesus ignores the tacky people. And you might have noted the tacky people. A couple of people come from Jairus' house. Jairus, sorry, your daughter is dead. We grieve for you. Now, please return home and let the master go on about his work. I want to suggest to you that's a little different from when people trying to be nice will say to someone grieving, well, he's in a better place now. Or, you know, this is part of God's plan. Or, there's a purpose behind that. Or, my favorite, God needed another angel. Let me use a theological word to describe all those responses: baloney. They're not true. God doesn't do that. God has no master plan to make you grieve. Death is sleep. It happens. It's part of life. And Jesus doesn't even spend the time of day to address the tackiness of those folks. And people who say that to you in your grief, and maybe, excuse me, but if you've said that to other people in their grief, it's because we're scared. We try to understand that which is not understandable. And Jesus does not even address it. Death is sleep. It happens. Don't try to theologize it. Don't try to rationalize it. It happens. So he doesn't even give them the time of day. But what he does do is focus upon the grieving father, because that's what Jesus specializes in. His heart repeatedly is moved by compassion. You find that throughout the Gospels, every Gospel. Moved by compassion, Jesus fed. Moved by compassion, Jesus healed. Moved by compassion, Jesus raises from the dead. You can imagine how the father crumbled. Your daughter is dead. No hope now. The knees buckle. The water faucets open up just like spillways on a dam that's overflowing. He had hoped, and now his hope is dashed. He crumbles. But Jesus, kneeling down as you can only imagine he would, pulling him up gently with an arm around him, says 6 words. And I want you to remember these 6 words, because they don't apply just to grief. But if you are facing an uncertain future, if you are wondering if the decision you made is the right one, if you are struggling with a relationship, any of these or 1,000 others, hear these words that Jesus says to a grieving father: don't be afraid, just keep trusting. Don't be afraid, just keep trusting. Repeat them with me. Don't be afraid, just keep trusting. Again, don't be afraid, just keep trusting. These are not magic words, but they're powerful words when they come from Jesus, the one who just dismissed death as sleep, the one who has rebuked the wind, the one who is master of sea and sky. When they come from Jesus, they mean something to you, especially if you are grieving a loss so dear as a child. Don't be afraid. Just keep trusting. And you know what happens next. Jesus enters the room and touches the child's hand. That's the 4th thing to note. Jesus' touch is powerful. Powerful. You might have noted that there was a discontinuity in the 2 passages, or in the passage that Tim read. Because in between the first part and the second part that I cobbled together, there's an illustration, there's a story of, as Jesus is going to Jairus' house, a woman who was ill reaches out and touches his garment, the hem of his garment, as it said, and she's healed. And Jesus stops and says, "Who touched me?" And everyone says, Everybody touched you. Just about. No. Someone in need touched me, and I felt power go forth. And she comes and says, it was I. And he blesses her. Because Jesus has the power that goes out to those who are hurting. The difference now is he is going to someone who is dead. And even then, he touches her hand, raises her up. It's very, very, very important. If the words, don't be afraid, just keep trusting, mean anything, or anything in the Bible means anything, or any way of understanding your life experiences can mean anything, it's very important to be close to the touch of Jesus. Look at you here. That's what the body of Christ looks like. People who have walked where you've walked. Anything you've gone through, people in this church have gone through, and they've walked close to Christ throughout. You stay close to Christ's touch by staying close to one another. In a body of faith such as this is where Jesus' touch is powerful. Jesus shocks and puts everything in a different perspective. Not to take away pain, but to give us courage and insight in the midst of it. Now, I'm going to stop here and pose a question to you that I do not want you to answer. It's a trick question, and you'll get mad at me if you give a sincere answer, and I'll say you're wrong. So don't answer it. Just think about it. Here's the question. Who raised Jairus' daughter from death? Who raised her? Who gave her life? Don't answer. Think. Most people obviously would say Jesus. Wrong. God. God, the Father, raised the child. Jesus simply trusted. Jesus simply trusted. God's the one who did it. Remember, Jesus raised Lazarus. Did he touch her? No. To touch him? No. He just called out, Lazarus, come forth. He wasn't even there. You think Jesus somehow go, poof. God raised the child. When Cameron, my son Cameron, was about 7 years old, he was in Tiger Cub Scouts. And I was at a den meeting, and the den leader asked a question of the boys, who is always happy and smiling? I think it was exactly, who is happy and smiling all the time? And that was a trick question too, because no one is happy and smiling all the time. We know that, except my son. Shot up this little bony arm of his and said, oh, I know. And he says, my daddy. My daddy is happy and smiling all the time. And he turns and looks at me with this wide, big grin. I, number one, was proud. That's my boy. Number two, boy, is he wrong. His daddy is not happy and smiling all the time. His daddy sometimes comes home stressed and fatigued. And remember, there's a lot of stress and fatigue when you only work one day a week like us preachers. I'm just saying. But the point is, he didn't see the stress and fatigue. He only saw his daddy smiling and happy all the time. Jesus looks at his daddy and knows that his daddy is compassionate all the time. That his daddy is powerful, the one that can create the quarks and the nebula and all of the black holes. His daddy is powerful. His daddy is abounding in steadfast love, faithfulness. And so with that trust, he was doing exactly what he told Jairus to do. Don't be afraid, just keep trusting, because he trusted that any bad thing that can happen to people can be nothing more than an opportunity for his daddy to come through for him. And that is what happened. Jesus trusted, and the girl was raised. Now, obviously, folks, we don't say, well, just believe enough and things will suddenly be happy. And just believe enough and the dead will be raised. The girl that he raised, Jairus' daughter, died sometime, we don't know when. Lazarus died sometime, we don't know when. But we do know that when we see that Jesus, whom we believe is the Messiah, the Son of God, will raise someone from the dead, that is a moment we have now that points to the reality then. That nothing will get in the way of God bringing life out of death. Life out of whatever situation you might find yourself in. Please listen to these reflections. Wherever there was pain, suffering, the fear of death, or death itself, such a place was nothing more than the arena where the Father could do something ultimately fantastic. Jesus believed his Father was constantly on the move, in the picture somewhere, shaping things, molding things, working things out in ways we cannot even begin to understand. This is the heart of the gospel that Jesus proclaimed. How else could Jesus enter the room of death and say, little girl, get up? He didn't raise the girl from death, his Father did. How else could Jesus go to the cross? He didn't raise himself up when he was dead as anything in the tomb. His Father did. Jesus had the childlike faith that whether in a death-filled room with loud mourners or in a dark grave shrouded in silence, sealed with a rock, God the Father will not be denied. God the Father will turn today's tears into tomorrow's laughter. God the Father will let life have the last word. So wherever you are in your grieving process, if you feel it's healed over or if the wound is fresh, remember that even though grief lingers, the hope of the gospel will move your gaze ultimately from the immediate pain to the broader perspective of God's, the Father's, redeeming love. Hear those words that gave strength and weakness, hope and despair, and remember them. Don't be afraid. Just keep trusting.